Hello everybody, in this video we're going to talk about the do-while loop in Java. So with the do-while loop, it allows us to do something unique compared to the other loops that we've kind of discussed so far. But with the do-while loop, it actually allows us to test the condition later. And we'll talk more about what that means in just a moment, but let's start off by kind of reviewing the do-while loop, or rather reviewing what we know about loops before we get into the do-while loop. So when it comes to loops, this is what we have learned about the flow of execution for loops and while loops that we've discussed previously. So the initializer runs once at the very beginning of the loop. Upon running, it checks the condition each time through the loop. If the condition is false, then the loop ends. Otherwise, the body of the loop is executed. So each time the condition is true, then the body of the loop is executed again and again and again and again. At the end of each iteration, we go back and check the condition, and if it's true, then we execute the code again. If it's false, then the loop ends. Just over and over and over again. That's why it's a loop. Right? So we check the condition, and then we execute the code. But our do-while loop is just a little different. The do-while loop actually allows us to kind of flip the flow of execution for our loop just a little bit. The do-while loop is what we call a post-test loop. And this means that we're actually checking the condition after we iterate through the code the first time. So whereas with our for loop and our while loop, we're checking that condition first, with our do-while loop, we're running the code first, and then we're checking the condition before we run it again. So let's look at an example of a do-while loop. Here's essentially a do-while loop. In this example of a do-while loop that we have here, we're essentially looking for a point that falls within our circle here. So we've got this circle here, and we're trying to find a point that falls within this circle on our X and Y axis. So we're going to check to see, well, as long as we're doing this, we're going to get this X value, we're going to get this Y value. If our values fall somewhere outside of our circle, we're going to do it again. Because that's essentially what our math is here. It's seeing that if they're greater than 1, if they're outside of the boundaries of 1, then we're going to go back and run this again. But we need to be able to get those coordinates the first time. And in a regular loop, unless we somehow seed it or somehow add the coordinates in, we would never get that code the first time. So we would have to do the assignment here of the variables X and Y with the values that we've determined here. And then check the condition, and if it doesn't meet the condition, then we can go ahead and move forward. But if it does meet the condition, then we go back and run the loop again. In this case, the condition being the values of the square root of X times X and Y times Y being greater than 1. So that's kind of the point of our do-while loop. We have to get this thing the first time before we can really do anything else with it. And one of the best things for it here, one of the best cases for a do-while loop is kind of like what we have illustrated here, is with a random number. I personally don't find a lot of uses for a do-while loop, but when I'm using random numbers and have to pull a random number from somewhere, do-while loops are often a really good way to utilize random numbers within a loop. If I have to do something like this and place a condition on my random number. So here's another bigger example. And in this bigger example here, essentially what we're doing is another great use case for a do-while loop, and that is in input validation, which is something that we haven't really talked about a ton yet. So here we're examining input validation for entering a number. And we're trying to find a double. It's Java, so everything's strictly typed. So we're looking for a double to pass through to our variable x at the very end, down here at the end of our code. But what if we don't get a double? What if we get something else? So that's what we have our do-while loop for. Well, our first half of our do-while loop here is checking to see if our input is a double, essentially. So we have this if statement, if n dot has next double. So we're looking for a double here. And if n dot has next double, we're going to set the value of OK to true. However, if our scanner doesn't have a double, we're setting the value of OK to false. We're passing the value of whatever was entered into a string, and we're printing it out. We're printing out a line to the console, an error line to the console, saying essentially that this word is not a number. And we're checking the condition on our while, part of our do-while loop, of while not OK. So while OK equals false, essentially. So if OK is true, then we go ahead and assign the value of x as the double that we got from the top part of our do-while loop. Otherwise, we're evaluating the else condition here, and we're going to refresh and start again and take another input from our user. So this is a pretty worthwhile example for what we can do with input validation when it comes to a do-while loop. Another good use case for do-while loops. So let's talk about what we just saw for a minute there. Let's kind of break that down into words, for those who are more lexicographically inclined. So this code looks complicated, but it's essentially just 3 steps. We're displaying a prompt. We're checking the input. If the input is valid, or if the input is invalid, rather, we're going to display an error and start over. Otherwise, we're going to read the input. So it's actually really simple code. There's a lot of code here. It looks like there's a lot of stuff going on, but it's really fairly simple. The code uses a flag variable, which is called OK, to indicate whether we need to repeat the loop body for if has next double. If that returns false, we consume the invalid input by calling next and just grabbing whatever is there on that next line. We can take anything with that next scanner method and pass it through to a string. We can then display our error message via the system.err method, and then the loop terminates when has next double returns true. So we'll kind of do this example in just a minute. Another thing to examine here are breaks and continues. Sometimes neither a pretest nor a post-test loop will provide exactly what you need. So in this case, the test needed to happen in the middle of the loop. As a result, we used a flag variable and a nested if statement. That's what we just did with our input validation example there. A simpler way to solve this problem is to use a break statement. So what is a break statement? A break statement, when a program reaches a break statement, it exits the current loop. So it just breaks. You can kind of think about it like a huddle. When you think about a huddle, like a huddle in football, everybody kind of gets around in a circle. And, like what do you see like in television and movies and even in athletics sometimes at the end of the huddle when everybody's getting ready to exit the huddle, oftentimes they'll shout, break. All right, so they take that circle, they take that loop that was there, and it splits apart and goes all sorts of different directions. So that's how we can consider this break statement when we're dealing with the break statement in our Java programs. So let's look at a break example. So we're dealing with input here again. We're dealing with input validation again. So we're checking this and saying, well, while true, we're going to allow our user to input. So system.out.print, enter a number if in.hasNext double. So if it is a double, we're going to break, and that's going to break us out of this while loop. Otherwise, we're going to take whatever value is in there, use the next method to pass it through to a string, and then print that error out and say that, oh, this word is not a number. So once we break out, we take that value of in.next double and we immediately assign it to our double variable of x. So that's what's happening essentially here. When we get into this break. So when we hit this break here, if this condition in.hasNext double evaluates as true, we hit this break. That forces us to jump all the way down here because we're breaking outside of this while loop. And we're taking the double that we got from our user and assigning it to our variable x. And then we can move on from there. So it's pretty cool. We also have a continue statement. In contrast to the break, continue allows the loop to continue on to the next iteration. So let's just jump over to our a REPL. I've got our REPL.it online IDE here for Java. And let's just do some examples. Right, so I'm going to do something a little bit different with our do while loop. So I'm going to use our break to check our condition. And I'm going to use our do while loop to do a little bit of something else. So what we're going to do is we're going to just do a little bit of code here to work on all of this. So let's zoom in a little bit. So we're going to be accepting a user input. So since we know that we're going to be accepting a user input, we need to use scanner. So since we're using scanner, we know we need to invoke scanner. We know we need to import scanner. So we're going to import java.util.scanner. Very nice. And we're going to go ahead and invoke scanner at the class level. So we're going to give a private scope scanner object of in, setting that equal to new scanner system.in. And we'll go ahead and we'll delete the hello world that we get by default from our main method that we get from our online IDE here. And we will write a new method that will give us the ability to take the input from our user. So we're just going to write an input method here with a little bit of input validation so that we can make sure that we're getting an integer. So we're going to write an integer method here, private int, we'll call it get num, and we will set an argument of string info so that when we call this method, we'll call it with the input message that we want to give our user. And so from here, we'll add a while loop, while true. We will system.out.print our info. So this will be whatever we invoke our method with. So if this dot in dot has next double, then we can go ahead and break. Otherwise, we are going to set a string variable of word equal to this dot in dot next, and print out an error, system.error.println word is not an integer. Otherwise, once it breaks out of that while loop, we're going to take the value of double n, and we're going to set that to n, or this dot n dot next int, and we are going to return n. So now this is our method with a little bit of validation here in order to do a little bit of input validation on an input. So it's pretty good. And if you want to kind of get caught up here, this would be a good point to pause the video, check this code out. We're going to go ahead and test it. So in order to test this, since we're using a non-static method, we need to call it in main. Our class here is called main because that's what we call, or that's what our online IDE calls our class by default. So we're going to create a new object for main, and we'll just call it obj equals new main. And then we'll just write up system.out.println for get num, and we will enter the value enter integer. Now we do get the, because we forgot to add the object. So let's add the object classifier there. So now we're invoking this method. If we enter anything that's not an integer, we should be able to, it should loop us back through, tell us to enter an integer again, and tell us what we entered is not an integer. Otherwise, it should echo back to us the integer that we enter. So let's try this out. I see the error I made. I put has next double instead of has next int. Let's go back and fix this. Oh, and I made that a double instead of an int. That's what I get for changing things on the fly. So, now, we're entering an integer now that we've done our fixes here. So if I enter something like an A, I should get told that A is not an integer, and I should be allowed to enter an integer again. So if I enter a 5, I should have echoed back a 5. Good. So now that's working. So now that I made those fixes that I made in error because I was looking at my notes where I had done a slightly different program, now would be a good time to pause and get caught up right here with this input validation. And let me zoom back out so we can kind of get it all in one screen for your pause so you can see that just a little bit better. So now that we've written this method that allows us to do a little bit of input validation and make sure we get an integer back from our user, let's do a little bit of another method that just plays with this input just a little bit. So this is just going to be a do while loop that's going to play with whatever result that we get a little bit. So we're going to write another method, and we're going to write this method as a void method because I'm going to want to print out everything within this method. I don't want to return anything to this method. So I'm going to make this a private void method, and we're going to call it eval num for evaluate number. And we're going to pass in an integer of n as our argument here. So what I want to do here is I want to print the number. And if the number is less than 30, I just kind of want it to stop. And switch that. If the number is greater than 30, I just kind of want it to stop. If it's less than 30, I want it to count up from its position to 30. So let's create our do part of our do while loop. System.out.println. And we'll just print the number, n. And that'll be the number that we get from the input. And then we'll add 1 to that number. So n plus plus. And then in our while part of our do while loop, we will check our condition. So while n is less than or equal to 30, we will do this thing. So this way we will get our number printed back to us at least one time. Otherwise, it's going to print back all of the numbers from our number to 30. Just a nice little proof of concept here. Not a whole lot of utility in this. So this is more of like a proof of concept. You take what you learn here and you apply it to what you want to do. Right? So now we can invoke this method in main. So this is going to be our obj.eval_num. And we're going to give it the argument of whatever we get out of our other method. So getNum with the argument of enter integer. We'll terminate that line with a semicolon. We'll delete that line, and we need to add our object classifier to that line. Good. So now we have our completed little proof of concept program here. And we can run this. So we can enter our integer. If we enter something that's not an integer like h, we get told that h is not an integer, and we get allowed to enter an integer again. If we enter something that's like 35, that's bigger than 30, we should get 35 echoed back to us, and it should stop. Perfect. If we get something that's less than 30, like let's say 18, it should count up from 18 to 30. So we should see 18, 19, 20, 21, so on and so forth, till we get to 30, and go. There we go. Perfect. So that's what we got here for this program. So again, just a little proof of concept to demonstrate both the break function, or the break command, and the do while loop. So that's all that I have for you for this video. Thank you for watching.